Found beneath a collapsed bridge after 31 years, a mystery ends here. The crane groaned, a beast of steel and rust, straining against the weight of 3 decades. Below, in the muddy moor of the riverbed, the final section of the old Blackwood Bridge waited to be lifted. It had been 31 years since the collapse, a night of screaming metal and swallowed headlights that had become the town of Oakhaven's founding myth and its deepest scar. For most, the bridge was a memory, a ghost story whispered to children. For the recovery team, it was just another slow, methodical clearing of debris to make way for the new state-of-the-art crossing that promised to connect Oakhaven to the future. But the future was about to be devoured by the past. The section of roadway, a slab of concrete and twisted rebar the size of a school bus, shuddered as it broke free from the river's suck. Mud and silt cascaded from its underbelly, releasing a smell that was more than just decay. It was the smell of secrets, of time itself rotting away. On the shore, a small crowd had gathered, mostly old-timers who remembered the night it fell, their faces etched with a familiar, solemn curiosity. They watched as the crane, with agonizing slowness, swung the massive piece of wreckage toward the designated staging area on the riverbank. That's when they saw it. It wasn't a glint of metal or the curve of a tire. It was something nestled within a cage of mangled rebar, something shockingly out of place. A pale form cocooned in the dark wet space beneath the road. A worker on the ground, a young man named Leo, with a 2-day-old beard and tired eyes, was the first to raise a hand, his voice cracking as he yelled up at the crane operator. "Hold it! Stop! Stop the swing!" The crane's engine whined down, and the colossal slab hung suspended in the air, dripping a steady rain of murky water. A hush fell over the onlookers. Even the river seemed to hold its breath. Leo scrambled forward, his boots sinking into the soft earth, his heart hammering against his ribs. He'd seen things on these jobs: animal remains, sunken boats, the occasional stolen safe, but this was different. This felt sacred and profane all at once. Reached the edge of the staging area, just as his supervisor, a burly man named Henderson, came jogging over. "What is it, kid? You see something?" Leo couldn't speak, he could only point. Henderson followed his trembling finger, his own face hardening as he processed the image. Cradled within the wreckage, as if in a grotesque, industrial womb, was a car, or what was left of one. A vintage sedan, its chrome long since surrendered to rust, its body crumpled like a discarded beer can. But it wasn't the car that made the air turn to ice, it was what was inside. Through the shattered rear windshield, a shape was visible. Not the jumbled mess of a mannequin or a pile of forgotten luggage. It was the unmistakable silhouette of a person, slumped over in the driver's seat. But that wasn't right. The official report, the one that had been quoted in every newspaper and anniversary special for 31 years, was clear. 6 vehicles had gone into the river that night. 6 vehicles had been recovered. 17 souls lost, all accounted for. There was no 7th car. No 18th victim. "Get the coroner," Henderson said, his voice a low, gravelly command, "and get the sheriff. Now." The news spread through Oakhaven like a contagion. By the time Sheriff Frank Miller arrived, the small crowd of onlookers had swelled into a somber mob, held back by a hastily erected police tape. Frank was a man in his late 50s, his face a roadmap of long nights and too much coffee. He'd been a rookie deputy the night the bridge collapsed. A kid who had spent weeks pulling wreckage and bodies from the cold, unforgiving water. That event had defined his career, his life. He thought he had buried it, along with the 17 victims. He ducked under the tape, his eyes immediately locking on the suspended wreckage. The car was a 1988 Ford Thunderbird, its once proud lines now a mangled parody. Its color was impossible to tell under the layers of mud and algae, but he could see the glint of a chrome bumper, a detail that sent a jolt of unwelcome familiarity through him. Frank Henderson said, his face pale. "We haven't touched it. Waited for you." Frank nodded, his throat tight. He walked slowly toward the hanging slab. The crowd behind him a murmur of hushed speculation. He felt their eyes on him, the weight of their collective memory. He was the keeper of this tragedy, the one who was supposed to have all the answers, and for 31 years, he thought he did. He stood directly beneath the car, the dripping water cold on his face and neck. The interior was a dark, soupy mess of river silt and decayed upholstery, but the figure was still there, a haunting sentinel frozen in time. The body was skeletal, of course, but it was draped in the tattered remains of clothing. A woman's dress, it looked like. The posture was what was so unsettling. She wasn't thrown forward, as if from an impact. She was slumped sideways, her head resting against the passenger side window, as if she had simply fallen asleep. "We need to get it down," Frank said, his voice barely a whisper. "Carefully. Set it on the blocks over there. I don't want anyone near it until forensics gets here." The process was excruciatingly slow. The crane operator, a man who had been doing this for 40 years, handled the controls with the delicacy of a surgeon. The slab was lowered onto a set of massive wooden blocks, the sound of its landing a dull, final thud that seemed to echo across the river valley. As soon as it was stable, Frank and a forensic technician named Sarah approached. Sarah was young, sharp, and blessedly new to Oakhaven. She hadn't grown up with the ghosts of the Blackwood Bridge. To her, this was a scene, not a seance. "The preservation is remarkable," she said, shining a high-powered flashlight into the car's interior, the anaerobic environment, the cold water. "It's like a time capsule." The beam of light cut through the gloom, illuminating details that made Frank's stomach clench. A purse on the passenger seat, its leather warped but intact, a single high-heeled shoe on the floor mat, and something on the dashboard. A small, white object. "Can you see what that is?" Frank asked, pointing. Sarah leaned closer, her face inches from the broken glass. "It's an envelope." An envelope. After 31 years at the bottom of a river, it seemed impossible. But there it was, propped against the speedometer, held in place by a layer of dried silt. Frank's mind raced. Who was she? Why was she here? The bridge collapse was a storm-related accident, a structural failure, an act of God. That was the official story. That was the truth he had helped cement. But this felt different. This felt like a secret. "We need to get the doors open," he said. "But we can't just pry them, we'll have to cut." The fire department arrived with the jaws of life, their sirens a fresh wave of alarm that drew even more people to the riverbank. Among them was an old man named Arthur Finch, a retired journalist who had covered the bridge collapse for the local paper. He stood at the back of the crowd, his gnarled hands gripping the top of a wooden cane, his eyes sharp and focused behind thick spectacles. He had always had his doubts about that night. Little inconsistencies, whispers that were quickly silenced, a feeling that the official story was too neat, too clean. He watched Frank Miller's face, seeing the same ghost of a doubt that had haunted him for 3 decades. The screech of the hydraulic cutter, slicing through rusted metal, was a sound that set everyone's teeth on edge. It was a violation, an intrusion into a tomb that had been sealed for a generation. With a final groaning pop, the driver's side door was forced open. The smell that rolled out was not the simple odor of decay. It was a complex, musty scent of river mud, rust, and something else. Something faintly floral, like long-dead perfume. Sarah, wearing gloves and a mask, leaned in carefully. Frank stood beside her, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered pistol. A habit he fell into when his nerves were shot. Sarah worked with meticulous care, first documenting the position of the body with a camera. The skeleton was fragile, held together by desiccated ligaments and the tattered dress. She gently brushed away the silt from the skull, revealing a full head of dark hair, matted and preserved by the mud. Then, she turned her attention to the purse. She lifted it out. Its weight surprising. It was heavy, solid. She placed it on a sterile tarp on the ground. Finally, she reached for the envelope on the dashboard. Her gloved fingers closed around it. It was stiff, the paper hardened by its long submersion, but it hadn't disintegrated. She held it up. There was writing on it, miraculously still legible in a faded, looping script. For Thomas, Frank's blood ran cold. Thomas. He knew only one Thomas connected to the bridge collapse. Thomas Corrigan, the brilliant, ambitious county engineer who had designed the retrofits for the bridge just a year before it fell. The man who had been hailed as a hero for his tireless work during the initial recovery, and then, in a shocking turn, had taken his own life just 6 months after the tragedy. The official reason was grief, the immense pressure of the aftermath. But there were always rumors, whispers that he couldn't live with what he knew. "Get that back to the lab," Frank said, his voice tight. "I want to know what's inside it yesterday." He turned his attention back to the car. Something else had caught his eye. On the floor, partially obscured by the driver's seat, was a man's shoe, a single, expensive-looking loafer. It didn't match the woman's high heel, and there was something else. A dark, circular hole in the driver's side window, just above where the woman's head would have been. It wasn't a crack from the collapse. It was a small, neat puncture. Frank had seen enough holes like that in his life to know what it was. It was a bullet hole. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a victim of the bridge collapse. This was a murder scene. A murder scene that had just been dredged up from the bottom of the river. The neat, tidy story of O'Caven's greatest tragedy, the story he had helped write, was a lie. He looked up from the car, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. Their faces were a mixture of shock, grief, and morbid curiosity. But somewhere in that crowd, was it possible that someone was looking back with a different emotion? Fear, panic. Was the person who pulled that trigger 31 years ago standing here, right now, watching their secret rise from its watery grave? The sun was beginning to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the riverbed. The hanging slab of the bridge, the mangled Thunderbird, the silent watching crowd, it all felt like a tableau from a nightmare. Frank felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. He had just opened a door to the past, and he had a terrible feeling that a monster was about to walk through it. The cliffhanger wasn't just about the identity of the woman, or the contents of the letter. It was the sudden, terrifying realization that the entire history of the town, the very foundation of its shared grief, was built on a crime, and the killer had been living among them, breathing the same air for 31 years. The mystery wasn't just who was in the car, it was who had put them there, and why the truth had been buried deeper than the wreckage itself. The forensic team worked under portable floodlights now, their movements precise and methodical, a stark contrast to the chaotic emotions churning through the crowd. Frank had ordered the area expanded, pushing everyone back, but he could still feel their presence, a collective weight of expectation. He stood apart, watching Sarah and her team carefully extract the skeletal remains from the car. They moved with a reverence that was both professional and deeply human. The woman in the Thunderbird was no longer just a shape. She was becoming a person again, bone by fragile bone. His phone buzzed. It was the deputy he'd sent to the archives. "Sheriff, you're not going to believe this. I'm looking at the original case files for the bridge collapse, the missing persons reports from that year." "What is it, Mark?" Frank asked, his voice low. "There was a woman reported missing a week before the bridge went down. Her car matched the description of a Thunderbird. The report was filed by her sister. Name was Eleanor Vance. Eleanor Vance. The name didn't ring a bell, but it felt solid, real. A piece of the puzzle clicking into place. Why wasn't she ever connected to the collapse? That's the thing, Sheriff. The report was withdrawn 2 weeks later. The sister called back, said Eleanor had been in touch, that she'd just run off to the city to start a new life. Case closed. A new life. Frank looked at the car, at the men and women in white suits, gently placing bones into evidence bags. It was a new life, all right. Just not the one her sister had described. Had the sister lied? Or had she been made to lie? The pieces were starting to form a picture he didn't want to see. A woman disappears. Her car is found 31 years later, at the bottom of a river, under the wreckage of a collapsed bridge, with a bullet hole in the window and a letter addressed to the bridge's engineer, who later killed himself. This wasn't just a murder. This was a cover-up. A cover-up on a scale he could barely comprehend. The bridge hadn't just been a tragedy. It had been an opportunity. The perfect, chaotic, meandered water-filled event to hide a secret, to hide a body. Someone had killed Eleanor Vance, driven her car into the river, and then, a week later, the bridge had collapsed on top of it, burying the evidence under thousands of tons of concrete and steel. Was it a coincidence, or was it something far more sinister? Could someone have known the bridge was going to fail? The thought was so monstrous, so unthinkable, that Frank dismissed it almost as soon as it formed. No, it had to be a coincidence. A killer's lucky break. But the doubt lingered, a cold, greasy film on his thoughts. He saw Arthur Finch, the old reporter, still standing at the edge of the police tape, his gaze fixed on the car. Frank walked over to him. "Evening, Arthur," Frank said. "Frank." Arthur replied, his eyes not leaving the scene. "They'll tell you, it's a miracle the river preserved it so well. I say the river doesn't give up its dead until it's ready to tell their story." He turned his sharp gaze on Frank, and, "I have a feeling this one is going to be a bestseller." Frank didn't smile. "You always thought there was more to it, didn't you?" "The official story was too simple," Arthur said. 17 dead is a tragedy. But a story with no villain? That's just bad weather. People need a villain, Frank. It helps them make sense of the senseless. The county blamed the storm, the state blamed the budget cuts, and everyone went home and grieved. But no one ever asked the right questions. And what were the right questions, Arthur? The old man leaned on his cane. They asked how the bridge fell. They never asked why it fell on that specific night. They never asked who stood to gain from it. He paused, his eyes glinting in the floodlights. And they never asked what Thomas Corrigan was so afraid of, that he'd rather eat a bullet than face another day. Frank felt that chill again, deeper this time. He looked back at the wreckage, at the dark water flowing past it, and knew that the story of the Blackwood Bridge was not over. It was just beginning. And the final chapter, buried for 31 years, was about to be written in blood, rust, and long overdue justice. The victim was Eleanor Vance. And the first time anyone in Oakhaven had truly seen her, she was a ghost. Not the skeletal figure pulled from the Thunderbird, but a vibrant, laughing woman in a photograph on the evening news. The picture, supplied by a distant cousin, tracked down in another state, was from the summer of 1987, a year before she vanished. She had a cascade of dark, curly hair, eyes that seemed to sparkle with a defiant intelligence, and a wide, generous smile. She was beautiful, and seeing her alive, full of light and promise, made the muddy reality of her tomb beneath the bridge all the more obscene. She was 26 years old, a paralegal who had just started working at the most powerful law firm in the county, Oakhaven Legal. The firm run by none other than Judge Harrison Sterling. Judge Sterling, the name was synonymous with Oakhaven. He was more than a judge. He was an institution, a patriarch who had presided over the town's legal and social life for 40 years. Now in his late 70s, he was retired, but still possessed an aura of unassailable authority. His family had practically built the town, and his influence ran deep, woven into the fabric of every bank, business, and political office. When the news broke about the car, about Eleanor Vance, Judge Sterling had issued a brief, formal statement expressing his profound shock and his deepest sympathies for a young woman whose promise had been so tragically cut short. He remembered her, he'd said, as a bright and diligent employee. Then, the gates to his sprawling hilltop estate had closed, and he'd remained silent. The hidden witness was a man named Samuel Jones, though no one had called him that in years. To the people of Oakhaven, he was just Sam the Drifter, a quiet, haunted man who lived in a ramshackle cabin deep in the woods that bordered the river. He was a Vietnam vet who had come home with more scars on the inside than on the outside. In 1988, he had been a younger man, but just as broken, living off the grid, finding solace in the solitude of the forest. He had seen something on the night Eleanor Vance disappeared, a memory he had drowned in cheap whiskey and buried under 3 decades of fear and self-loathing. He had seen headlights where they shouldn't have been, heard a sound that wasn't a backfire, and watched a car slip silently into the black water. He'd told himself it was none of his business. He'd told himself he was just a crazy vet, seeing things. But when he saw Eleanor Vance's picture on the TV in the corner of the town's grimiest bar, the face of the ghost that had haunted his dreams for 31 years, he knew he could no longer stay silent. The past had come for him, too. The antagonist, though no one yet knew it, was a man who moved through Oakhaven with the quiet confidence of someone who owned the very ground beneath his feet. Michael Sterling, Judge Harrison Sterling's only son. In 1988, Michael had been the town's golden boy, handsome, charismatic. A recent law school graduate working at his father's side, poised to inherit the Sterling dynasty. He was the kind of man who had never been told no, who believed that rules were for other people. He had a charming smile that didn't quite reach his cold, calculating eyes. He also had a temper, a vicious, ugly thing that he kept hidden behind a veneer of polished respectability. 31 years later, Michael was the one running the show. He was the managing partner at the law firm, a kingmaker in local politics, his influence even more pervasive than his father's had been. He was married, had 2 perfect children, and lived in a glass house overlooking the new bridge. He had watched the recovery efforts from his panoramic window, a tumbler of expensive scotch in his hand, a knot of ice tightening in his stomach. The connection between the 3 of them was a toxic triangle of power, desire, and secrets. Eleanor Vance, working late at the Sterling law firm, had been smart and ambitious. Too smart. She had stumbled upon something she shouldn't have, a discrepancy in the firm's trust accounts, a pattern of transactions that suggested not just embezzlement, but a sophisticated money laundering scheme tied to a major construction company. The construction company that had been awarded the no-bid contract for the Blackwood Bridge retrofits a year earlier. The company that answered to Thomas Corrigan, the county engineer, and the money trail, she suspected, led all the way to the top, to the Sterlings themselves. Eleanor was not a fool. She knew the danger she was in, but she was also principled, and perhaps a little naive about the depths of human cruelty. She had confronted Michael Sterling, not with an accusation, but with a question, a carefully worded inquiry about the accounts that let him know that she knew. It happened in the firm's law library, a cavernous room filled with the scent of old paper and leather. The lights were low, the rest of the staff had gone home. I was just reconciling the quarterly statements for the Bridge Project Trust, she'd said, her voice calm, her heart pounding. And I found some invoices that don't seem to match the disbursement records. I thought you'd want to know. Michael had been leaning against a bookshelf, a picture of casual authority. But as she spoke, his smile vanished. The charm evaporated, replaced by something cold and flat. Which invoices, Eleanor? She showed him the file. He didn't look at the papers. He looked at her. He saw the intelligence in her eyes, the resolve. He saw that she wasn't just a paralegal. She was a threat. You've been working hard, Eleanor, he said, his voice smooth as silk, but with an edge of steel beneath it. Maybe too hard. People can make mistakes when they're tired. I'm not tired, Michael, she replied, holding his gaze, and I don't think this is a mistake. That was her own death sentence, and she didn't even know it. Michael's world was one of control. He did not allow for loose ends. He did not allow for threats. He saw Eleanor, not as a person, but as a problem to be solved. And he solved his problems permanently. A few nights later, he called her, his voice laced with a false sincerity. He'd looked into the accounts, he said. She was right. There was something wrong, and he was grateful she'd brought it to his attention. He suggested they meet somewhere quiet, to discuss it further. He needed her help to untangle it before he took it to his father. He suggested a secluded spot by the river, near the old access road, not far from the Blackwood Bridge. We need to be discreet, he'd said. For the firm's sake, Eleanor, wanting to believe in the system, in the idea that right would prevail, had agreed. She'd written a letter to Thomas Corrigan, the one person she thought might be an ally, a man caught in the middle. She intended to give it to him the next day, a failsafe in case her meeting with Michael went wrong. She put the letter in her purse, got in her Thunderbird, and drove to the river. From his cabin deep in the woods, Samuel Jones had seen the headlights cut through the trees. It was unusual for a car to be down on that old road so late. He'd been cleaning his rifle, the familiar weight of it a comfort in the deep, dark quiet of the night. He'd watched as the car pulled to a stop. A few minutes later, another car arrived, a sleek, dark sedan. A man got out. A tall, well-dressed man. He saw the two figures talking near the first car. He couldn't hear their words, only the low murmur of their voices. Then the tone shifted. It became sharp, angry. He saw the woman recoil, saw the man grab her arm. Samuel had frozen. Every instinct, every bit of training he'd tried to forget, screamed at him to intervene. But the fear was a physical thing, a paralysis that held him rooted to the spot. He was a ghost, a drifter. Who would believe him? What could he do against a man who drove a car like that, who wore a suit like that? He was a nobody, so he did nothing. He just watched. He saw the flash. It was so quick, he almost missed it. And the sound, a sharp pop, that was immediately swallowed by the vast, indifferent night. He saw the woman crumple to the ground. He saw the man stand over her for a moment, his silhouette a black cutout against the starlit water. Then, with a chilling efficiency, the man had opened the Thunderbird's door, pushed her body inside, and then put the car in neutral. He gave it a hard shove, and the car rolled silently down the muddy bank and disappeared into the river with a soft, final splash. The man had watched for a moment, then got back in his own car and driven away, leaving nothing behind but the chirping of crickets and a ripple on the surface of the black water Samuel had thrown up in the bushes. Outside his cabin, he had stayed there, shaking, until the sun came up. He told himself it was a dream, a hallucination brought on by the war and the whiskey. He buried the memory deep, but it never truly went away. It festered, a poison in his soul. Now, 31 years later, the river had given up its secret. In his office, Michael Sterling watched the news report, his face an unreadable mask. He saw Eleanor's smiling face and felt a flicker of something. Not remorse, but a cold, pragmatic anger that this complication had arisen after so long. He had been so careful. He had even orchestrated the call from Eleanor's sister, a woman from the city. He'd paid a handsome sum to impersonate her and closed the missing persons case. He had thought of everything, but he hadn't thought of the bridge collapsing. At the time, it had seemed like a gift from the heavens, a divine intervention that had buried his sin under a mountain of public grief. He'd even used the tragedy, leveraging the chaos to further embed his family's construction interests in the rebuilding efforts, solidifying their power for another generation. He had turned a murder into an opportunity in his cabin. Samuel Jones switched off the small battery-powered TV. He looked at his reflection in the dark screen. He saw the face of a coward. He had spent 31 years running from that night, from the sound of that single, sharp pop. But now, seeing her face, knowing her name, he understood that running was no longer an option. The river had spoken, and it was demanding a witness. Sheriff Frank Miller sat in his office, the lab report on the envelope in his hand. The paper was standard stationery, but the ink was a match for pens from the late 1980s. The letter inside, however, was the bombshell. It had been painstakingly dried and scanned, the elegant looping script now digitized on his computer screen. It was a confession, a plea, and an accusation all in one. "Thomas," it began, "I'm writing this because I'm afraid. I know you are a good man, caught in a terrible situation. I know what the Sterlings are making you do. I've seen the records, the false invoices for the bridge work, the money they are stealing. It's not just greed, is it? It's something more. The materials you were forced to approve, the substandard steel, the corners that were cut. No, the bridge isn't safe. You told me yourself, that night at the fundraiser, after you'd had too much to drink. You said you couldn't sleep at night. You said it was a house of cards waiting for a strong wind." Frank had to read that part twice. The bridge isn't safe. It wasn't just a murder. It was a conspiracy that went to the heart of the town's founding tragedy. The 17 people who died in the collapse. They weren't just victims of a storm. They were victims of greed, of murder. The letter continued. I am meeting with Michael tonight. He says he wants to fix it, but I see the look in his eyes. I think he knows that I know everything. I'm giving this to you as insurance. If something happens to me, you are the only one who can expose them. Don't let them get away with it. Don't let them bury the truth with their money and their power. For God's sake, Thomas, do the right thing. It was signed, simply Eleanor. Frank felt a profound, sickening sorrow. For Eleanor, who had seen the truth and paid for it with her life, and for Thomas Corrigan, the brilliant engineer who had been trapped. He hadn't been a villain. He had been another victim. He had received this letter, or rather, he had never received it. Eleanor had been killed before she could give it to him. But he already knew. He knew the bridge was a death trap. And when it fell, the weight of those 17 souls had been too much for him to bear. His suicide wasn't because of grief, it was because of guilt. He was the 18th victim of the Blackwood Bridge. Bad Frank now had the motive, the victim, and the prime suspect, but he had no physical evidence linking Michael Sterling to the crime. The bullet they recovered from the car door was a common caliber, impossible to trace without a weapon. The scene was 31 years old. Michael Sterling was a pillar of the community, protected by a fortress of wealth and influence. Accusing him would be career suicide without an airtight case. He needed more. He needed a witness. The injustice began to escalate, slowly at first, then with brutal speed. Frank's initial discreet inquiries into the old bridge contracts were met with a wall of resistance. Files were suddenly missing from the county archives. Records had been damaged. In a basement flood, a decade ago, the construction company that had done the work had been bought out twice and its old paperwork was long gone. Every door he tried to open was locked and bolted. He could feel the Sterling influence, like a change in the atmospheric pressure, a silent, powerful force pushing back against him. He decided to pay a visit to Judge Harrison Sterling. He drove up the winding road to the Sterling estate, a magnificent stone mansion that looked more like a fortress than a home. The judge received him in his private study, a room that smelled of old books and power. He was a handsome man, even in his old age, with a full head of silver hair and eyes that were as sharp and clear as blue ice. Sheriff, the judge said, his voice smooth and controlled. To what do I owe this pleasure? I'm investigating the death of Eleanor Vance, Frank said. Getting straight to the point, the judge's face registered a flicker of something annoyance, perhaps before settling back into a mask of solemnity. A terrible tragedy. My son Michael is quite shaken. He remembers her fondly. I'm sure he does, Frank said. I have reason to believe her death was not an accident, and that it may be connected to her work at your firm. Judge Sterling steepled his fingers, his gaze unwavering. Sheriff Eleanor Vance was a junior paralegal. She was a child. The idea that her work had anything to do with her disappearance is frankly absurd. She was a beautiful young woman. In my experience, when beautiful young women disappear, it is usually a matter of the heart. A jilted lover, a jealous rage. I would suggest you look there, instead of chasing shadows in my family's past. It was a warning, delivered with the polite, dismissive tone of a man who was not used to being questioned. You are out of your depth. Back off. Frank left the estate with a nod of anger in his gut. The judge wasn't just protecting his son. He was part of it. He had to be. The entire system was rigged. Meanwhile, Michael Sterling began to move. He wasn't a man who waited for a threat to materialize. He neutralized it preemptively. His first target was the narrative. He leaked a story to a friendly reporter at the state newspaper. The story, quoting anonymous sources close to the investigation, painted Eleanor Vance as a troubled young woman. It hinted at a secret affair with a married man, a volatile personality, a history of instability. It was a classic smear campaign, designed to discredit her before she could even speak from the grave. Her character was being assassinated 31 years after her body had been. His next target was more direct. Samuel Jones, after days of wrestling with his conscience, had finally worked up the courage to act. He'd left his cabin and walked the 5 miles into town, straight to the sheriff's office. He was a wreck, his hands shaking, his voice a hoarse whisper. But he told Frank everything he had seen that night. The 2 cars, the argument, the flash, the splash dot. It was the breakthrough Frank needed. An eyewitness. It was shaky, sure. A traumatized vet with a history of drinking. But it was something. Frank took his statement, assuring him he would be protected. It was a promise he would fail to keep. That night, 2 sheriff's deputies, men whose careers had been sponsored by the Sterling family, paid a visit to Samuel's cabin. They didn't come to protect him. They came with a message. They didn't beat him. They were more subtle than that. They just talked to him. They reminded him of his past, of the drunk and disorderly charges, the vagrancy citations. They told him how a jury would see him, a confused, unreliable old man trying to get his name in the papers. They told him what happens to people who tell lies about important men. You didn't see anything that night. Old man, one of the deputies said, his face inches from Samuel's. You were drunk, you were dreaming, you tried to tell anyone. Otherwise, and we'll find a way to make sure you spend your last years in a state hospital, you understand. They tore up his official statement in front of him and left him shaking in the dark. The fear he had lived with for 31 years came rushing back, stronger than ever. They hadn't laid a hand on him, but they had broken him completely. When Frank came to check on him the next day, Samuel was gone. His cabin was empty, the door swinging in the breeze. He had vanished, a ghost swallowed by the woods once more. Frank was furious. He knew who was behind it. He confronted the 2 deputies, but they played dumb, their faces masks of innocent confusion. He had no proof. He was isolated, his own department working against him. The final blow came from the state level. Michael Sterling, using his vast political connections, had a quiet word with the Attorney General. Suddenly, Frank's investigation was being shut down. A memo arrived from the state capitol. The discovery of Eleanor Vance's body was officially being ruled a cold case. Its connection to the Blackwood Bridge collapse, speculative and unsubstantiated. Due to the passage of time and lack of new physical evidence, the state was declining to press the investigation further. Frank was ordered to cease all activities related to the case and release his files to the state police, where he knew they would be buried forever. He was being neutered, publicly and professionally. Michael Sterling had outmaneuvered him at every turn. He had smeared the victim, intimidated the witness, and leveraged the power of the state to kill the investigation. The injustice was absolute. The truth was being buried. This time under a mountain of legal paperwork and political favors. Frank sat in his office late at night. The town he had sworn to protect dark and silent outside his window. He looked at the picture of Eleanor Vance. Her smiling face, a mockery of the justice she had been denied. He had failed her. He had failed Samuel Jones. He had failed the 17 people who had died on that bridge. Michael Sterling had won. He was bolder, more untouchable than ever. He had taken a 31-year-old murder and turned it into a demonstration of his absolute power. He had proven that in Oakhaven, the Sterlings were the law, and the truth was whatever they said it was. The conflict hadn't just escalated. It had been brutally, decisively crushed. Frank was left with nothing but the ashes of his investigation and the haunting knowledge that a monster was sleeping soundly in his glass house on the hill, confident that his secrets were safe and his sins would never find him out. But secrets have a way of clawing their way to the surface, and this one was about to explode. The plot twist was not in a dusty file or a forgotten memory, but in the mundane, overlooked possessions of a dead woman. After the state had officially shut down his investigation, Frank had been ordered to box up all the evidence related to the Eleanor Vance case. He did it himself, a grim, solitary task in the basement evidence room. As he was carefully placing Eleanor's water-damaged purse into a plastic container, he felt something hard and flat in a zippered side pocket. The forensics team had catalogued the main contensor wallet, keys, A tube of lipstick but this small. In a pocket had been sealed shut by decades of silt and pressure. Driven by a last desperate flicker of defiance, Frank took the purse home with him that night, a clear violation of every rule in the book. He didn't care. He was a man with nothing left to lose. In his kitchen, under the harsh glare of an overhead light, he worked for an hour with a small knife and a pair of tweezers, carefully cutting the stitches and prying open the sealed pocket. Inside, nestled in the rotted silk lining, was a small, flat object wrapped in oilcloth, a microcassette tape. His heart hammered against his ribs. It was a long shot. The tape was 31 years old, submerged in river water. It was almost certainly destroyed. But it was a chance. He remembered he had an old microcassette recorder in a box in his attic, a relic from his early days as a detective. He found it, cleaned the corroded battery contacts, and put in a fresh pair of AAs. The small motor whirred to life. With trembling hands, he inserted Eleanor's tape. He pressed play. For a moment, there was only the hiss of static, the sound of a dead recording. His shoulders slumped. It was over. Then, through the static, a voice. Faint, distorted, but there. Don't think this is a mistake. It was Eleanor's voice. Clear and defiant. Frank's blood ran cold. He recognized the line. It was what Michael Sterling's smear campaign had twisted, claiming she was unstable. But here, in her own voice, it was the sound of courage. He heard a man's voice, smooth and condescending. You've been working hard, Eleanor, maybe too hard. It was Michael Sterling. Frank leaned closer to the small speaker, his entire world shrinking to the sound coming from the tape. Eleanor had recorded her confrontation with Michael in the law library. She had known. She had been preparing her defenses, gathering her evidence. The recording continued, a tense back and forth. Her calm, pointed questions met with his increasingly strained, veiled threats. And then came the part that changed everything. This isn't just about money, is it? Michael, Eleanor's voice was steady, but Frank could hear the tension in it. It's the bridge. The inspection reports you had Thomas Corrigan sign. The materials. You switched them, didn't you? You used substandard steel from that bankrupt supplier in Ohio, and billed the county for the top-grade materials. You, and your father. You pocketed millions. But the bridge, Michael, people are going to die. A long silence. The hiss of the tape seemed to grow louder. Then Michael's voice, no longer smooth, but a low guttural snarl. You have no idea what you're talking about. You are a stupid little girl playing detective, and you are going to get yourself hurt. I've already made copies of the invoices, Eleanor said, her voice shaking slightly now. And I've written a letter to Thomas. He knows he'll talk. Thomas will do what he's told, Michael sneered. Just like everyone else. You think your little letter is going to save you. You think anyone will believe a nobody. Paralegal over the Sterling family. We own this town. We own the police. We own the judges. We own you. You are nothing. The recording ended abruptly. Frank sat back, stunned, the sound of Michael's voice echoing in the silent kitchen. Own the police. We own the judges. It wasn't just a confession to fraud. It was a confession to a conspiracy that had led directly to the deaths of 17 innocent people. He hadn't just murdered Eleanor to cover up embezzlement. He had murdered her to cover up his responsibility for the single greatest disaster in the town's history. The bridge collapse wasn't a killer's lucky break. It was the inevitable result of his and his father's sociopathic greed. This tape changed everything. It wasn't just about bringing a killer to justice anymore. It was about exposing a rot that went to the very core of Oakhaven. The full conspiracy was laid bare. The Sterling's father and son had orchestrated a massive fraud scheme, knowingly endangering the public for profit. Thomas Corrigan was their unwilling accomplice, trapped by their power. Eleanor Vance was the one person brave enough to challenge them, and they had silenced her. Then, when the inevitable happened and the bridge fell, they had used the town's grief as a shield, hiding their monstrous crime behind the facade of a natural disaster. The stakes had shifted from a personal quest for justice to a public scandal of unimaginable proportions. This tape was dynamite. It would not just destroy Michael and Judge Sterling, it would shatter the town's history, its institutions, its very identity. Frank knew he couldn't go through official channels. The Sterlings had proven they controlled the system. The state police would bury the tape. The DA would find a reason not to prosecute. He had one shot to make this public, to detonate this bomb in a way that no one could cover it up. His mind raced, formulating a plan. It was risky, unorthodox, and probably illegal. But it was the only way. The annual Oakhaven Founders' Day ceremony was in 2 days. It was the biggest public event of the year, held in the town square. The keynote speech was always delivered by a member of the Sterling family. This year, for the first time, Michael Sterling would be taking the podium in his father's place, cementing his role as the town's new patriarch. The entire town would be there. The regional media would be there. It was the perfect stage. Frank made a high-quality digital copy of the recording. He then contacted Arthur Finch, the old reporter. He met him in a secluded diner miles out of town. He didn't tell Arthur what he had, only that he needed his help. He needed him to get the word out to every real journalist he knew, from the state capitol to the national news outlets. "Tell them to be in Oakhaven Town Square in 2 days," Frank said, his eyes burning with intensity. "Tell them the ghost of the Blackwood Bridge is about to speak." Arthur, seeing the look on Frank's face, asked no questions. He just nodded, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. It's about time. The tension was now at its absolute peak. Frank was no longer a defeated sheriff. He was a man holding a weapon of mass destruction, waiting for the right moment to push the button. Michael Sterling was preparing to step into the spotlight, to accept the adoration of the town he had betrayed, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire world was about to be vaporized. The hidden clue hadn't just surfaced. It had provided the script for a public execution. The stage was set for a cinematic payoff that would either vindicate Frank and honor the dead, or get him killed. The whole town was holding its breath, and they didn't even know why. The air in Oakhaven was thick with the silence before a storm that had been brewing for 31 years. Founders' Day dawned bright and clear, a perfect autumn afternoon. The Oakhaven Town Square was a sea of smiling faces, American flags, and the smell of hot dogs and popcorn. It was a Rockwell painting come to life, a celebration of community and history. But beneath the festive surface, a different kind of history was about to be made. Frank Miller stood at the back of the crowd, dressed in his full sheriff's uniform, his face a grim, unreadable mask. He had a small, powerful, battery-operated speaker in a duffel bag at his feet. Arthur Finch had done his job well. Frank could spot at least a dozen unfamiliar faces in the crowd. Men and women with press badges and professional camera equipment, drawn by the old reporter's cryptic promise of a bombshell. On the grandstand, decorated with red, white, and blue bunting, the town's elite were seated. Judge Harrison Sterling sat in the seat of honor, looking frail but regal, a living monument to the town's past. Beside him, radiating confidence and charisma, was his son, Michael Sterling. He was the man of the hour, the future of Oakhaven. He smiled and waved to the crowd. The very picture of civic virtue. The mayor's introductory speech was a fawning tribute to the Sterling family's legacy. And now, it is my distinct honor to introduce a man who embodies the spirit of Oakhaven, a leader who will guide us into a new era of prosperity, Mr. Michael Sterling. A wave of polite applause rippled through the square. Michael walked to the podium, his expensive suit perfectly tailored, his smile perfectly practiced. He looked out at the faces of the people he had defrauded, the people whose loved ones he had allowed to die. He felt nothing but a sense of ownership. This was his town. These were his people. "Thank you, Mayor," Michael began, his voice smooth and resonant, amplified by the PA system. "My friends, my neighbors, it is with a heart full of humility and gratitude that I stand before you today. My father, Judge Harrison Sterling, taught me that the foundation of any great community is trust. Trust in our institutions, trust in our leaders, trust in each other. At the back of the crowd, Frank met Arthur's gaze. The old reporter gave him a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was time. Frank reached into his duffel bag. For 31 years, Michael continued, his voice swelling with false emotion. We have all lived with the memory of the Blackwood Bridge. A terrible tragedy, a scar on our collective soul. We lost friends, family, neighbors. But, in our grief, we found strength. We rebuilt. We endured, and we honored the memory of the 17 souls we lost that night. 18. Frank's voice boomed. He hadn't used the speaker. He had just yelled it, his voice raw with a fury he had suppressed for weeks. A ripple of confusion went through the crowd. Heads turned. Michael Sterling paused, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second. He couldn't see who had shouted. "Excuse me?" Michael said into the microphone, an edge of annoyance in his voice. Frank took a step forward. "I said 18, he repeated, his voice louder this time, carrying across the square. "You forgot one. You forgot Eleanor Vance." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Michael's face went pale. He stared out, his eyes scanning, trying to find the source of the disruption. He saw Frank, in his uniform, standing defiant. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through him. "Sheriff Miller, this is hardly the time or the place." Michael began, trying to regain control. "This is the only time, and the only place," Frank shot back. He reached down and switched on the speaker in his bag, turning the volume to maximum. The hiss of the microcassette filled the air. A ghostly sound that cut through the festive atmosphere. Then, Eleanor's voice, clear and strong, echoed across the town square from beyond the grave. "Don't think this is a mistake." Michael Sterling froze at the podium, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. His father, the judge, seemed to shrink in his chair, his face ashen. The crowd stood in stunned silence, their smiles vanishing, replaced by confusion and dawning dread. Then came Michael's voice, captured 31 years ago, dripping with condescension. "You've been working hard, Eleanor, maybe too hard." The conversation played out, every word a hammer blow against the Sterling family's reputation. The reporters surged forward, their cameras flashing, microphones extended, capturing every second of Michael's public unraveling. The townspeople listened, their faces turning from confusion to shock, from shock to outrage. They heard Eleanor's brave accusation, her voice filled with a terrible prophetic fear. "The bridge, Michael, people are going to die." A woman in the front row, whose parents had died in the collapse, let out a gut-wrenching sob. The sound broke the spell of silence, and a low, angry murmur began to sweep through the crowd. Then came the final damning lines from Michael, his voice, a vicious snarl that was unrecognizable from the charming man at the podium. "You think your little letter is going to save you? You think anyone will believe a nobody paralegal over the Sterling family? We own this town. We own the police. We own the judges. We own you. You are nothing." The tape ended. For a moment, there was absolute silence. The only sound was the wind rustling the flags on the grandstand. The entire town, the entire world, had just heard the truth. The Blackwood Bridge wasn't an accident. It was mass murder for profit. And the man they had been about to celebrate as their leader was a monster. Michael Sterling stood at the podium, paralyzed. The blood had drained from his face. He looked like a statue, his mouth half open in a silent scream. He looked at his father, who stared back at him with dead eyes. The patriarch's long reign of corruption and deceit collapsing in on itself in a matter of minutes. Then, the rage erupted. It started with one man, a burly construction worker whose brother had been one of the victims. "Murderer," he screamed, his voice thick with hate. The cry was picked up by others. "Killer. You killed them. You killed them all." The crowd surged forward, their grief and shock curdling into a tidal wave of fury. The flimsy barricades around the grandstand were torn away. The two deputies who had intimidated Samuel Jones, standing near the stage, exchanged a panicked look and melted back into the chaos. abandoning the family they had protected for so long. Frank Miller pushed his way through the crowd, his hand on his weapon. He wasn't moving to protect Michael. He was moving to arrest him. He reached the stage, just as the first angry townspeople were climbing onto it. He stood between them and the catatonic Michael Sterling. "Get back!" Frank yelled, his voice carrying the authority he had been denied for so long. "Get back, he's mine." He turned to Michael, whose eyes were wide with terror. The mask was gone. The charm, the power, the arrogance, it had all been stripped away, leaving only a pathetic, frightened man. "Michael Sterling," Frank said, his voice cold and clear, for all the world to hear. "You are under arrest for the murder of Eleanor." Vancy paused, letting the weight of his next words sink in. "And for the deaths of 17 other people." He pulled out his handcuffs. The click as they locked around Michael's wrists was the loudest sound in the world. It was the sound of justice, 31 years delayed. It was the sound of a town's foundation cracking. It was the sound of a dead woman finally being heard, as Frank led the trembling, shattered Michael Sterling off the stage. Through the parting sea of angry, weeping faces, he looked at Judge Sterling. The old man hadn't moved. He just sat there, his empire of lies in ruins around him, a ghost in his own life, condemned to live out his final days in the shadow of his son's monstrous crimes and his own. The payoff was absolute. It wasn't just an arrest, it was a public exorcism. The cinematic climax wasn't a courtroom bombshell. It was a trial and conviction held in the court of public opinion, in the very heart of the town that had been so brutally deceived. The ghost of the Blackwood Bridge had spoken, and it had brought down a dynasty. The truth hadn't just come out, it had erupted, washing away 3 decades of lies in a single, explosive, and cathartically just wave of righteous fury. The aftermath was not one of quiet healing, but of a deep, resonant haunting. The arrest of Michael Sterling and the subsequent implication of his father didn't bring closure. It ripped the scab off a wound the town of Oakhaven never knew it had. The Founders' Day ceremony became known as the Reckoning. The town square, once a symbol of community, was now the scene of a collective trauma. The place where their history was revealed as a lie. Michael Sterling's trial was a swift and brutal affair. With the tape as irrefutable evidence and the entire state watching, his high-priced lawyers could do little more than plead for mercy. But there was no mercy to be had. Family members of the bridge victims packed the courtroom every day, their faces a silent, powerful jury. They listened as the full extent of the fraud was laid bare. The cheap steel, the falsified safety reports, the millions of dollars funneled into offshore accounts. Michael was convicted on all counts: the murder of Eleanor Vance and 17 counts of manslaughter. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, destined to rot away in a concrete cell, a world away from his glass house on the hill. Judge Harrison Sterling was never charged. His health declined rapidly after his son's arrests, and he was declared mentally unfit to stand trial. He lived out his last year as a prisoner in his own mansion, cared for by nurses, his mind lost to dementia. His name now a curse in the town he had once ruled. He died without ever publicly acknowledging his crimes, a final, silent act of defiance. The Sterling Empire crumbled, its assets seized, its law firm dissolved, its name erased from buildings and charities, a dynasty wiped from the map. Sheriff Frank Miller became a hero, but it was a title he wore with discomfort. He had exposed the truth, but he could never shake the feeling that he had been complicit in the lie for 30 years. He had helped build the myth of the tragic accident. He retired a year after the trial, unable to shake the ghosts of the past. He had won, but the victory felt hollow, paid for with too many lives, too much time. Samuel Jones, the hidden witness, was found a month after the arrest. He hadn't run far, just deeper into the woods, living in a makeshift shelter, terrified of the world. When Frank found him and told him what had happened, that he was safe, that he was a hero, the old man simply wept. He wept for the woman he had seen die, and for the 31 years of fear he had carried alone. He was given a small pension and a new apartment in town, but he rarely left it. The world was still too loud for him. The most poignant tribute came not from the town, but from a single, quiet act. A new grave marker appeared in the Oakhaven Cemetery. It was placed next to the row of 17 headstones that had been erected for the victims of the bridge collapse. This new stone was simple, made of polished gray granite. On it was an engraving of Eleanor Vance's smiling face, taken from the photograph that had started it all. Below it, the inscription read, Eleanor Vance, 196 to 1988. She told the truth. One knew who paid for the stone, but it became a place of pilgrimage. People would leave flowers, small notes, tokens of remembrance. She was no longer the forgotten victim. She was the town's conscience, a symbol of the terrible cost of silence. One crisp autumn evening, a year after the trial, Frank Miller drove out to the site of the old Blackwood Bridge. The new bridge soared above the river, a graceful arc of steel and light, a testament to modern engineering. But Frank's eyes were on the riverbank below, where the mangled wreckage of the Thunderbird had been brought ashore. The town had decided to leave it there, partially enclosed by a simple fence, as a permanent memorial. It was a stark, ugly reminder, a piece of rust and ruin that refused to be forgotten. He got out of his car and walked to the fence. The sun was setting, the sky ablaze with streaks of orange and purple. He thought about the 17 people who had plunged into the dark water that night. Their final moments filled with terror, all because of the greed of two men. He thought about Thomas Corrigan, the good man who couldn't live with his complicity. He thought about Samuel Jones, his life stolen by fear, and most of all, he thought of Eleanor, a brave young woman who had a choice, to stay silent and safe, or to speak up and risk everything. She had chosen to speak. She had put her faith in the truth, and it had cost her her life. But in the end, her voice, captured on a tiny magnetic tape, had been more powerful than all the sterling money and influence. Her voice had brought down an empire and rewritten a town's history. The air grew cold. The last light of the sun faded from the sky, and the new bridge lit up its lights. Reflecting on the dark, placid water, Frank stood there for a long time, a solitary figure in the twilight. The case was closed, the killers were punished, the truth was out. But there was no peace. There was only the haunting echo of the past, the quiet rush of the river, and the knowledge that some secrets, once unearthed, can never be buried again. They just become a part of the landscape, a permanent scar on the heart of a place, a tragic reminder that justice, when it comes too late, feels an awful lot like grief.